Chris Johnston of Sportsnet. How you doing?
I'm doing great, boys. How you doing?
Very good.
The Jake Muzzin trade helped him get home last night.
Yeah, it did help me get home. I got stuck in Toronto traffic when there was snow, Johnson. You know what that's like.
How long was it? Did I hear 4 hours, or is that just
Yeah, my
an
20-minute drive was 3 hours, 40 minutes.
Wow.
Massive.
All right, let's talk about this deal. Are you surprised that the Leafs and Dubas could pull this off?
I'm a little surprised, especially this far from the deadline to be able to get Jake Muzzin and not have to give up anything off the current roster, not have to give up one of their absolute top prospects. It's not to say that they didn't give up any assets here, but, I think that the price is pretty fair. And it's not for nothing that they get him an extra 13 games by making the deal at the end of January rather than at the end of February. And I think that time will be particularly useful for Jake Muzzin to get comfortable in a new conference, in a new city, in a different spotlight, and potentially on the right side of the defense if that's where Mike Babcock ends up using him.
CJ, is Dubas done here?
I don't think so. Not with 4 weeks left. It would be far too soon to say that. Right now, I guess the biggest issue that the Leafs have is they don't have a ton of cap space to make another significant move. If they are to bring in another player on a sizable contract, it's likely going to be in concert with a move to take someone off the current roster to make the space for the salary cap. But, there's all kinds of time left. I don't think that can be ruled out. And what's clear that we know from the Leafs front office and really everyone around the organization is that this is an organization that sees an opportunity to win this year. They believe that they can contend for the Stanley Cup. And while there's obviously a tough road ahead of them with both Boston and Tampa in their division, that's just to get beyond the first two rounds. I think they're going to do everything they possibly can to increase the chances that they have to win. So, there's a potential, I guess, to bring in goaltending help still behind Freddie Anderson. I could see another addition on the blue line and, maybe even some depth at forward, although that currently is where they're deepest at this time.
Yeah, and being up against the cap obviously presents its limitations, but getting Muzzin, a lot of people have drawn the straight line to Muzzin, his deal, and the year that comes after this, and the end of Jake Gardiner in Toronto because he'll be an unrestricted free agent. Follow me, this might be a little from left field and maybe even counterintuitive if you're making the run now, but is there a possibility that Dubas could think about moving Gardiner in order to free up a little bit of cap space for the end of the year and maybe bring in something they could use more than a Jake Gardiner?
It's possible, but I think it's pretty unlikely.
Right.
I do. He's just got such a fan in Mike Babcock, as Jake Gardiner. I think really right throughout the organization that, I think that it would be tough to see them making a move, even if it is just for the end of the season where they get better, in trading away Jake Gardiner. And so, I do think that's a long shot, but clearly getting Jake Muzzin is Jake Gardiner insurance at minimum. I've thought it was unlikely Gardiner was going to be back, even if they didn't make a trade like this. Now that they have made a trade like this and have another left shot D under contract for $4 million next year, which is, definitely below what Jake Gardiner's value is going to be, wherever he signs, even if he signed here at a reduced amount, it would be above that. They've now positioned themselves well where they can absorb that kind of loss. And I don't think by any stretch it's because they want to lose Jake Gardiner. He's just the next in a line of guys that, the salary cap is made him where the Leafs can't pay him. But, I would be extremely surprised if he was moved ahead of that time. I just think they'll ride out the season, try to have the best possible roster, and then recalibrate come the offseason.
Right.
CJ, looking at the rest of the roster ahead of February 25th, how important is it for Dubas to get Matthews' contract done ahead of the deadline?
Well, it's becoming maybe a little bit less important now that he's got this deal done because, I do think this is likely to be the biggest move the Leafs make. It's potentially the only move the Leafs make before the deadline. And so they do have, they have the knowledge now, I guess, of what Muzzin's going to cost them next year. All along, I think it's been the preference to get Matthews and preferably Marner, although, they haven't negotiated with him at his request during the year. But they'd like to know where these guys are going to end up, I think, as what a lot of people watching this situation, because, There's a huge variance, I guess, in what it potentially could be, whether they do, a shorter deal like 5 years or an 8-year contract, the maximum allowable. And it's going to be a huge point, as soon as we get beyond the season, because next year in particular is going to be a big pinch for them. As I mentioned, Jake Gardiner is probably gone. Ron Hainsey, another unrestricted free agent, is likely out the door. They may even have to be in a situation trading a player with some salary just to make it all fit together. So I think the sooner they know exactly where those numbers are going to be, the better. It does seem as though there's been some progress with the Matthews cap. So, I think it's very possible that they do get this extension done before the trade deadline with Auston Matthews. And, it does start to fill in some of the boxes a little bit more clearly.
Yeah.
And that impacts every decision they got to make, whether it's signing Kapanen, Andreas Johnston. I mean, all these guys are restricted free agents going into next season.
Wow, that'd be real interesting for the Leafs. Hey, listen, we only got a couple minutes here, maybe even just a minute left in this segment. But I know that you were suggesting that this was a buyer's market, and it looked like, at least in this deal, that it might be a buyer's market. I know that some of the GMs have become tired with the ridiculousness that the two networks in this country have made deadline day. This is made about a month ahead of deadline day. Are we going to see more moves in advance of deadline day, Chris?
I think it's very possible.
Yeah.
Because if your team's like LA, there's only so many first-round draft picks that are going to go around. I mean, you can start going around the league and see how many true buyers there are. I'd call it somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 teams. And only so many of those teams own a first-round pick they're willing to trade. Obviously, Toronto was one of those, and they parted with it in the Muzzin deal. There's not a lot of that kind of asset out there. And even though there's a variety of different players, a lot of forwards, a couple more D, that potentially could get that kind of return. I think if you're selling, you have to recognize where the market is, and that, sometimes by waiting right to the last minute, perhaps the last hour or the last day, it doesn't mean that the market will be stronger, because there's only so many teams in the market for these players. So, I think the Kings were wise in a lot of ways to set a price and to make a deal even this far out from the deadline. There's some risk, obviously, but I do think there's risk in just assuming the deals will get better the closer you get to the deadline. And with it being such a buyer's market with so many players of pretty decent name value and guys I think still have some quality hockey in them out there available, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw more of a run on deals in the next few weeks. And, there's always going to be something left for deadline day, but it might be a lonely 10 hours on air there for myself and our colleagues, on the 25th, if more big names change addresses before then.
Well, we're never lonely when you're here, CJ. You're always good people's good company. Good stuff
Yeah,
on
and
that.
there'll still be good pizza backstage, so that's good.
Yeah,
Sportsnet, it's all about the pizza on deadline day.